Hey everyone, thanks as always for your time. NASA Exploration Ground Systems at the Kennedy Space Center is working towards an early October date to move Orion to the Vehicle Assembly Building for final Artemis II stacking. But we're in between high visibility milestones right now. The focus this week was on practice and planning. I'll go through that news and an update from EGS on their contingency pad access system, which is a tool they built to allow Orion and SLS to stay at the pad if necessary and shorten delays between launch attempts. I'll also go through notes on the latest Orion hardware to ship to KSC and the latest political maneuvering around the Artemis III lunar landing mission and Washington's race with China. In Artemis II Watch this week, we're still looking for updates on Orion encapsulation in the Launch Abort System facility. The Orion Launch Abort System tower was stacked on the crew module late last month, and NASA Kennedy Space Center Public Affairs said early in the week that 2 of the 4 ogive panels had been installed. However, the most recent imagery released was taken over 2 weeks ago. KSC PAO did publish a media advisory for an event there after the Artemis II Orion is stacked in the Vehicle Assembly Building. The event was tentatively scheduled for mid-October, with a more specific date to be determined later. That is suggestive that Exploration Ground Systems are staying close to the plan of moving Orion to the VAB in early October, less than a month from now. Some additional edited video was also published of the installation of the South Korean KRAD CubeSat in early September. The secondary payload was installed in a dispenser in the Orion stage adapter, while both of them are in the multi-payload processing facility. Ahead of pre-flight briefings for Artemis II in a couple of weeks, NASA also published an article on some of the mission's science. The crew will be participating in a lot of it, but the article also highlights the 4 CubeSats on the flight manifest themselves. In addition to the South Korean CubeSat, Saudi Space Agency's Space Weather CubeSat is also in the MPPF. The article describes the other 2, one from Argentina and one from Germany. The OSA has to be stacked before Orion, so the status of stacking preparations for those 2 elements are at the top of the watch list right now. For the OSA, the questions are about whether the other 2 CubeSats have arrived at the Kennedy Space Center and the remaining work to get the OSA ready to move from the MPPF to the VAB. For Orion, the questions are about the status of crew module encapsulation in the LAS ogive fairing. The Artemis II crew also continues their regular posting on social media. In this post, Dr. Jenny Gibbons posted a shot in the Orion simulator around a recent launch training practice run. She is backing up Jeremy Hansen for the Canadian Space Agency. As the post says, this was during an ascent run, and looking at the displays, this was taken at a mission elapsed time of 5 minutes 41 seconds, during the SLS core stage phase of ascent. Just above that, we can see the engine lights for the core stage, and one of them is out, indicating that one had shut down early. You can also see to the left that the T-MECO has been adjusted to what looks like 9 minutes 35 seconds, versus a more nominal 8 minutes 15 seconds or so. And below that, the time left in the burn, the time to go, or TGO, of 3 minutes 52 seconds. Below that, we can also see that an AMT high, alternate MECO target, has been selected. It's hard to make out the number of the engine which is out above in the left display, but in the bottom pane there it appears to be engine 3, and it's a bit more prominently shown in the top half of the middle display. Also, if we look at the engine number positions in the coordinate system, engine 3 is the lower right, so that suggests the display layout there. It's an ascent sim, so it's unlikely a single engine out is the only failure that Dr. Gibbons is dealing with, but that's what's the most obvious with the displays not totally legible. Thanks to NASA Exploration Ground Systems and Kennedy Space Center Public Affairs, they provided a render of the contingency pad access system to help visualize what the set of platforms would look like if they were temporarily installed at the pad. As the name implies, the system would only be installed, used, and then removed in a contingency case during the weeks in between lunar launch periods. The plan is for Artemis II to roll out to Launch Pad 39B, go through a week and a half of countdown preps and a wet dress rehearsal tanking test to set up for at least 3 launch attempts in a lunar launch period. As I've been running through in videos this year, final preparations in the vehicle assembly building would be synchronized with a to-be-determined launch period. NASA probably has something in mind, perhaps February, but that will be locked in later. Matt Check with EGS described the purpose of the system in a recent interview.
With our flight termination system range requirements, we're constrained pretty tightly. But so the whole point of the pad access, and I don't know how much you guys got before, but the whole point of the pad access is to be able to stay for the next launch period. So, we're going to roll out, do a full wet dress tanking test, and then turn right around and get back into the campaign for launch. You can do all that and get through the first launch period. But for the second one, you'll have to R&R some of those FTS components. So that's the whole benefit of this thing, of this system, right? Is to be able to stay at the pad, change out some of those components there versus having to roll back, which is what we had to do for Artemis I. We saw that, hey, this was a big challenge for us. Artemis I, we had a lot more launch opportunities. Now you got one period a month. So we want to stay out there as long as we can, and that's what that affords us.
This contingency pad access system was started as a lesson learned from Artemis I. During the Artemis I launch campaign, the vehicle was rolled back to the VAB from the pad multiple times, but only one of those was planned in advance. On Artemis I, if they ran into problems that take a few days to resolve, or bad weather, or both, and they ran past the end of a launch period, they either had to get a waiver from the Eastern Range, or they had to roll back, because they could not recycle the vehicle's flight termination system on the pad. This system essentially provides platforms that allow EGS and launch processing prime contractor Amentum access to those components at the pad. This is a video frame image of the locations of access doors on the SLS booster forward skirts and the core stage inner tank. In the VAB, these are accessed from Platform F. The render hypothetically shows what the system looks like installed at the pad. The platforms would need to be lifted into place and temporarily attached and secured to the mobile launcher umbilical tower. As we see from the render, the contingency pad system provides access from the mobile launcher umbilical tower to those doors. From there, personnel can remove those flight doors that face the tower and set up internal platforms inside those parts of the rocket. The system won't provide any extra weather protection, which was why the final Artemis I rollback occurred, but it will give the launch team the flexibility and the opportunity to stay at the pad and recycle the vehicle and those specific systems, assuming any other maintenance necessary could also be done at the pad. Although the Artemis I vehicle was rolled back from the pad to the VAB for some maintenance, by the end of the launch campaign, EGS and Amentum, then Jacobs, were doing some of that maintenance on the vehicle at the pad. There will be a couple of weeks or more in between lunar launch periods where the system could be installed to provide access inside those parts of SLS. After the maintenance was completed, those volumes of the rocket would again be closed out for launch, and then the platforms would be disconnected from the mobile launcher and removed. We first heard about this in public in an audio-only media briefing back on January 9, 2024, when NASA announced a delay of Artemis II and III, at the time moving the launch dates from late 2024 and late 2025 to September 2025 and September 2026, respectively. At the time, the head of the Moon to Mars Program Office was Amit Kshatriya, who was named the agency's associate administrator here at the end of the summer of 2025. Back then, Mr. Kshatriya noted that Exploration Ground Systems was going to use the extra time to look into a system like this.
The last thing I'll say about Artemis II is that even though we want to fly, and we want to fly as safely as we can. With the delay, we're going to take advantage of some additional capability and incorporation of lessons learned from Artemis I, including the ability to potentially access the vehicle at the pad during the launch campaign and during potential weather events. So I'll move on.
Since then, I have returned to the subject in interviews with EGS officials to try to keep up with the progress of design and fabrication of these platforms. Orion and SLS were designed to be serviced in the VAB, but rolling out and rolling back from the pad have their own risks and put extra wear and tear on some connections. Rolling back and rolling out again also takes more time, a long workday and most of the day to go in one direction or the other, but much more time to disconnect the mobile launcher from one place and connect it somewhere else. Orion and SLS also have to be reconfigured, along with other mobile launcher systems, when moving from the pad to the VAB and back. As Mr. Check noted in the interview last month, the launch periods for Artemis II have more constraints on them than for Artemis I, due to the extra re-entry constraints on the Orion heat shield for Artemis II. As it turns out, there will be about a month in between the usable launch periods, and NASA will set up to maximize the number of launch attempts they can make for each period. With other upgrades to the infrastructure at Launch Pad 39B, EGS has the ability to make 4 launch attempts in 6 days. However, the hope is that they will be able to launch without needing to make that many attempts. The hope is also that they won't need to use this contingency pad access system for Artemis II. About a month ago, we saw what appeared to be a completed pressure vessel for the Artemis V Orion crew module, kind of on display at the Michoud Assembly Facility in New Orleans during a visit by NASA and Lockheed Martin management for the Orion program. We'd last seen the structural elements for the crew compartment partially welded in the middle of 2024, but the new undated picture indicated that the 7 major welds were complete, preceded by bolting the backbone assembly inside the barrel and aft bulkhead. This week, NASA Kennedy Space Center Public Affairs published edited video of the pressure vessel arriving at the Neil Armstrong Operations and Checkout Building in the KSC Industrial Area, and then moving it into Lockheed Martin's Orion Industrial Operations Zone there. The arrival of the pressure vessel starts assembly of the Artemis V build, joining assembly and test of the Artemis III and IV spacecraft there. Those builds are the first trio under the Orion production and operations contract that started in 2019 and would be the first 3 to be reused. It's not clear the degree of reuse yet, with the Artemis II spacecraft still being prepared by Exploration Ground Systems for launch of that flight test. The pressure vessel is the core of the crew module primary structure. A couple of the next milestones will be outfitting of the rest of the primary structure and a proof pressure test. As I said last month when we saw the completed pressure vessel still in New Orleans, Orion is a part of the Artemis V plan that Congress supports and has provided money for, but it's not in the White House plan. We're still waiting for clarity on whether NASA will be allowed to continue working on EGS, Orion, and SLS hardware for Artemis 4 and 5 when the new fiscal year starts on October 1st. Lockheed Martin was aiming to deliver the Artemis III spacecraft to EGS for launch processing at the end of 2026. There exist somewhere delivery dates for the Artemis 4 and 5 builds, but those are not in public or kept up to date in public. On Friday, September 12th, China conducted a second static fire of a Long March 10 test article at the Wenchang spacecraft launch site. The test article remains on a mobile launch platform at the Launch Complex 301 pad there. After the stage and a full design set of 7 engines fired for about 30 seconds last month, objectives of the latest test were said to again include demonstration of the integrated behavior and performance of the stage main propulsion system and the 7 engines, but also recovery operations for the future. The test was 320 seconds long and included 3 firings of different sets of engines to simulate in-flight launch and then post-staging recovery burns. The Long March 10 is the triple-core version of the launch vehicle that is needed for China's initial crewed lunar landing. However, recovery is planned for a single-stick version of the system, the Long March 10A. As with the other lunar lander architectures rumored to be in the latest moon race, we still don't have enough information to put this test in the context of an overall development schedule. All we have are the ultimate launch dates. The most recent reports were that the Long March 10A could fly early next year, and the tri-core Long March 10 could fly for the first time perhaps at the end of 2026. Perhaps. In the Artemis-related political news and notes for the week, the House of Representatives Appropriations Committee approved their version of the funding bill that includes NASA. The Commerce, Justice, Science, and Related Agencies bill was approved by a vote of 34 to 28. The funding details in the approved bill are the same as the draft published back in July. The White House proposed a 25% cut to NASA and almost a 50% cut to science, but neither the Senate nor the House bill endorsed that. NASA gets about $25 billion versus the $20 from the White House. The White House wants to retire the current Artemis programs in the next 2 years. However, neither the House nor the Senate bills adopt that plan. Both of them talk about some ideas for eventual Artemis off-ramps, but different ones. The Senate proposal restores the Science Directorate funding to last year's levels, while the House proposal makes a smaller cut and moves that from science to exploration. We'll have to see whether a compromise bill is worked out between the House and the Senate, and what that bill and report language looks like for NASA if there is a compromise bill. There's less than 3 weeks to the beginning of the new fiscal year. Washington has institutionalized starting the year with a continuing resolution or nothing, and that's what the debate will be about until that first deadline. This year, that will bring with it some extra uncertainty and doubt about which NASA projects will be allowed to continue work and whether the White House is going to fire more of the NASA workforce. The hearing in the Senate last week on September 3rd does seem to be having some continued influence. Congress has been the main advocate for the U.S. to return to the moon and wants to ensure that the next people to land on the surface are Americans. Former NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine, who came up with the Artemis brand name change in 2019, was the star witness in that hearing. 6 years later, and over 4 years after leaving office, Bridenstine said what others have said or are thinking, that China's lunar landing program is more likely to land the next people first.
The purpose of this hearing is, are we going to be able to get to the moon first? I mean, that's the title of the hearing. And I will tell you, and I know there's going to be questions, and I'll go into more depth later, but look at the architecture that we have developed to land American astronauts on the moon. Look at the architecture. It is extraordinarily complex. In some cases, it hinges on me saying here today that it is highly unlikely that we will land on the moon before China. And I'm going to explain it in the next 2 minutes. So, number one, we have the SLS rocket, which is the most powerful rocket ever built. And Senator Cruz mentioned, yes, it has had its problems in the past. It has been expensive. It had overruns, all those things. But it's behind us. It's done. We need to use it. We have the Orion crew capsule, which, quite frankly, is a shiny object in this whole thing. The Orion crew capsule is not only usable today, but ultimately the cost is going down because more and more of it is reusable every time we use the Orion crew capsule. Those two elements are in good shape. I will tell you, I have been critical of both in the past, in front of this committee and other places, and I'm more than happy to be critical of all of our contractors, just to be really clear. But I will say what we don't have today. Here's what we don't have today. We don't have a landing system for the moon. And there was a moment in time when we had no NASA administrator. It was after I was gone and before Senator Nelson became the NASA administrator, an architecture was selected. And I don't know how this happens, but the biggest decision in the history of NASA, at least since I've been paying attention, the biggest decision happened in the absence of a NASA administrator. And that decision was, instead of buying a moon lander, we're going to buy a big rocket. And I want to be clear, we need this rocket to be successful. It's important for the country and it's transformational. But in the meantime, the architecture is as such. We need to launch Starship. That first Starship is a fueling depot that's in orbit around the Earth. Then we need to launch, nobody really knows, but it could be up to dozens of additional Starships to refuel the first Starship. This is an architecture that no NASA administrator that I'm aware of would have selected had they had the choice. But it was a decision that was made in the absence of a NASA administrator in the last administration. It's a problem, it needs to be solved, and that puts us as a nation at risk of not being the first on the moon. I should say the first next on the moon, because we did land in 1969 to 1972.
Having the quote-unquote father of Artemis and the main spokesman for America's return to the moon during Trump's first term say that the U.S. is behind China seems to have drawn the current NASA leader more strongly into the race, or at least the race rhetoric. Whether the White House is moving their actions in that direction remains to be seen. The White House budget was crafted early in the year when Elon Musk was still in control there, and the emphasis in the budget was on going to Mars, retiring the current Artemis programs, and investing in commercial services for beyond Earth transportation. Before the hearing, current acting NASA Administrator, Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy, was more muted about highlighting a race with China to the moon. In a Johnson Space Center Public Affairs podcast recorded in mid-August, Duffy only mentioned the race once and in the same sentence as the race to Mars that Musk and SpaceX are focused on. After the hearing, Duffy was much more focused on the moon first, and the race in particular, in remarks to the NASA workforce the next day, and then in a social media post and video quickly produced the day after that. While the emphasis in rhetoric changed, all the questions about milestones and timelines remain untouched. There was one little tidbit about the Artemis III date, still very vague, but at least a little revealing. In that podcast recorded back in mid-August, Duffy spoke to the dates for Artemis II and III.
So, again, we have Artemis II early next year. We hope earlier rather than later. We're all speaking on the same page there, but we're in a good timeline right now. Mm-hmm. And then Artemis III is, in mid to late 27.
Mid to late 2027 opens up the last quarter of that year, and hints what is also widely rumored, which is that the official Artemis III date of mid-2027 is optimistic, if not aspirational, and will be delayed again. But late 2027 isn't that specific either. Without some idea about the schedule for interim flight tests and milestones, it's hard to tell if a late 2027 estimate is also aspirational instead of realistic. More recently, in a media briefing on September 10th, Duffy said that Artemis III would be about 18 months after Artemis II. If Artemis II were to fly somewhere in the first quarter of 2026, that math would put Artemis III in the third quarter of 2027. In other words, in the summer 2 years from now. So has the schedule improved from quote-unquote mid to late 2027 to quote-unquote 18 months after Artemis II? The words are being chosen very carefully in the video and in other public posts. But there's little supporting evidence provided to tell if Artemis III is ahead or behind China, or just if Artemis III is ahead or behind the 2027 calendar. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe if you find these videos informative and want to find out what's going on with Artemis every week. Big thanks, as always, to the members of this YouTube channel who are helping make it possible to keep doing this. I am posting additional content and updates if you're interested in joining. If you're willing to make a one-time donation to help support what I do, I would really appreciate it. I put a link to my Buy Me a Coffee page in the description. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.